All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to take a look at great theories of everything, ancient and modern, and just try to size them up and figure out how to use them. The best way that we can use them for helping us with our paradigm shifting, our awakening to 5D consciousness, our formation of a holistic worldview. And today is our 554th video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. And Mr. Larson lived from 1898 until 1990. And he left behind many books on physics and chemistry and astronomy, and also he has a book on metaphysics, including philosophy, religion, biology, psychology, and he has 2 books on economics. And all of these books are based on the same theory. So he has one theory and he plugs it into every subject. And his theory is mostly set out in his first postulate. The universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. So in Larson's universe, the world is not made out of matter, it's not made out of energy, but it is made out of motion. And in Larson's universe, motion is the relationship between space and time. You can see that in the most basic kind of motion that we know of, speed. I was running at 10 miles per hour. 10 miles of space in 1 hour of time. Space over time is speed. And if you double the speed, and you now say, I'm sprinting at 20 miles per hour. But you can also say, I'm sprinting at 10 miles per half hour. You can either double the space or you can have the time. That is a reciprocal relationship. So, at least for as far as speed goes, we do have a relationship, reciprocal relationship between space and time. Larson spreads that out and applies it to all forms of motion, which he considers to be all scientific phenomena. So matter is a form of motion. Energy is a form of motion. Pressure is a form of motion. Capacitance is a form of motion. And all of our other scientific quantities, they are all fractions with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator, with the caveat that space and time can be in multiple dimensions, multiple exponents. Now, when Larson applies this to economics, he's really saying, okay, well, our economic system is a system of motion also. And this is what he calls economic science, or Ronald Satz called econophysics. This is a scientific approach. And so we need to set aside the sociological economics, the economics where you're trying to propagate your preferences for justice or fairness or something to that effect, your political preferences. First, you have to deal with the actual reality, the scientific reality, which is that just like if you're constructing a building, well, you can say, I like the building to be red or green, or, I'd like it to have these stylistic features. But ultimately, if it does not conform to the laws of physics, it's going to collapse regardless of any of that. And so Larson is attempting to construct an economic system that is based on the laws. And then you can put in your ideological stuff. So he breaks down economics to its first principles by going with this Robinson Crusoe approach, starting out with the economic system of one person on a deserted island, and then gradually phasing in barter, money, and then employees up to the modern economic system. Larson finds that our two reciprocal entities, just like time and space in the physical world, in the economic world, those two entities are production and consumption. And Larson constructs a number of principles around all of these. Right now in this book, we are in chapter 14, which is called Business Cycles. Hopefully we'll get to the end of this chapter today. And if you'd like to get a little bit more information about the reciprocal system, you probably want to check out any of my first 474 videos on the subject. And if you want to get to the beginning of this book, you go back about 5 weeks and start with chapter 1. But for now, we're moving forward from about 2/3 of the way into chapter 14. I'm going to read the last sentence of the previous paragraph and then move along. So, the stronger the forces operating to drain the reservoirs, the lower the levels that will be eventually reached, and the greater the strain that will be effective toward restoring normal conditions when the external forces are removed. Just how far the rise will go before reaching its peak depends on a number of factors. One of the most important of these is the size of the reservoirs, which depends on the productive capacity of the nation. Countries that live close to the margin of starvation do not have business depressions. They have famines, wars, pestilences, and the numerous other collective ills to which the human race is subject, but not depressions. At the other extreme, the United States, the land of greatest physical wealth, has the worst booms and depressions, just as would be expected from the theoretical principles that have been developed. The larger the reservoirs, the more they can affect our economic life if they are not properly controlled. A beaver dam may break without any serious consequences, but an uncontrolled release from a larger reservoir may result in a catastrophe. We have every reason to believe that the continued increase in technological knowledge will result in a constantly increasing production of wealth as time goes on, and unless adequate control measures are taken in time, there is little doubt but that the 1929 debacle will ultimately be repeated on an even greater scale. Such controls are readily available, however, and it is to be hoped that before the next upheaval of this kind is due, economic thinking can be clarified to the point where the requirements for control of the cycle will be recognized and the necessary actions will be taken. One of the primary objectives of the present work is to contribute to such a result. Another factor in determining the magnitude of the cyclical swing is whether or not the boom is capped by a speculative orgy. All periods of rising prices are favorable settings for excessive speculation, but the situation is much the same as that which exists in the western forest in the early fall. Toward the end of the dry season, every forest is a potential tinderbox, and serious fires can be expected periodically. Nevertheless, the forests do not all burn every year, because in addition to the favorable burning conditions, there must also be a spark that strikes a vulnerable spot and sets off the conflagration. Similarly, in the case of a business boom, the potentiality of a runaway condition exists near the top of every upswing, but only occasionally is it converted into reality by a strong enough impetus. Before turning to a consideration of the downswing, it is desirable to call attention of an important transition point on the upward curve. This is the point at which maximum employment is reached. Under present conditions where no effective policy for maintaining full employment is being pursued, this is not a situation in which every person is working to the limit of his capacity, but the highest level of employment that can normally be reached under the prevailing economic policies. This maximum is affected by a number of factors, but it is fairly definite. As brought out in Chapter 11, any increase in the flow of money purchasing power to the producer has an effect on both production volume and price until maximum employment has been attained, after which any further increase is absorbed entirely in higher prices. If the business boom has been moderate and has not passed into the highly unstable speculative stage, the withdrawals from the reservoirs slack off gradually as the increased internal resistance in those reservoirs begins to overcome the upward momentum of the cycle. Since part of the artificial business prosperity is due to the unbalance between production price and market price that results from the reservoir withdrawals, any decrease in the rate of withdrawals makes further business expansion less attractive even while the trend of the cycle is still upward. Expansion is also discouraged when the normal labor supply is exhausted and labor can only be attracted to new ventures by outbidding existing enterprises. The first indication of a coming change is therefore a slowing down of the demand for new capital for business expansion purposes. It is this timing that has led some observers to suggest that the development of conditions unfavorable to new business financing is the cause of the downturn. Actually, however, this is merely one link in the chain of events stemming from the originating cause, rather than a causal factor in itself. The real cause of the reversals of the cycle can be found in the finite limits of the money and credit reservoirs and the increased resistance to withdrawals as the reservoir levels approach these limits. A substantial amount of borrowing during the upswing is done merely for the purpose of taking advantage of rising prices. As soon as the rate of price increase slows down, the possible gains of this kind diminish, and the demand for credit decreases. Some borrowers begin to liquidate their debts. The effect of the decreased borrowing is cumulative, as it still further reduces business gains and money-making opportunities, thus leading to a further drop in borrowing and further repayment of debts. These changes decrease the outward flow from the money reservoirs, and in time, the net balance of the reservoir transactions becomes inward rather than outward. Market prices then fall relative to production price, and a recession is on the way. The absolute price level may not fall immediately because of coincident wage increases, but it is a decrease in the relative price level that causes the decline to begin. There is no stable condition at the top of the cycle. The rise has been possible only because of external forces acting against the internal resistance of the reservoirs. And as soon as the external forces weaken, the downswing starts under the influence of the ever-present internal stresses. A bouncing ball is a good analogy. The ball cannot remain at the top of its cycle. When the initial upward momentum is overcome and the ball stops rising, it immediately starts downward because of the ever-present pull of gravity. There have been many expressions of puzzlement as to why it is not possible to maintain the gains that are made during a boom, why economic disasters such as that of 1929 should strike when general conditions appear to be unusually favorable. For instance, Mitchell makes this comment, quote, "The more vividly this cumulative growth of prosperity is appreciated, the more difficult becomes the problem why prosperity does not continue indefinitely instead of being but one passing phase of business cycles." End quote. Reynolds' second question, quote, "Why doesn't expansion continue indefinitely?" expresses the same thought. The answer is clear from our analysis. The boom prosperity is due to the withdrawals from the money reservoirs, and it cannot continue indefinitely because those reservoirs have finite limits. As soon as the withdrawals start, the inevitable decrease, the business cycle, as soon as the withdrawals start the inevitable decrease, the business decline begins. In case there has been a speculative excess, which has superimposed an additional price rise on top of the normal cycle, the downward trend is likely to be initiated with the force of an explosion. Here there is a pyramid of fictitious values supported by nothing but the hope and belief that prices will rise still higher. It is if this belief receives even a mild shock, it expires, and the whole speculative edifice collapses. In spite of the spectacular character of these sudden deflations, however, they are not essentially different from the milder recessions, other than in degree. The causes of the disaster are implicit in the upswing. What goes up must come down. Furthermore, the greater the rise, the greater the subsequent fall. The decline must continue in the absence of effective countermeasures until the reservoirs are refilled sufficiently to generate a resistance to further decline. The more nearly they are emptied during the boom, the more will have to be diverted from the current money purchasing power stream to refill them to this resistance point. The most serious aspect of the business decline arises from the ratchet action mentioned by J.M. Clark in the passage quoted in chapter 11. During the upswing, both production volume and price increase, but in the decline, there is relatively little drop in price because the determining factor, the wage level, is quite inflexible in the modern economy. Production volume therefore bears the brunt of the recession. If the reverse were true, that is, if the producers could cut wages rather than volume, the business cycle would have little effect on the ordinary citizen, since changes in production price are promptly reflected in market price, and as a consequence, the ability of the average consumer to purchase goods is not impaired by the wage cuts. But a reduction in employment in the volume of goods produced strikes directly at the well-being of the entire community. Here is one of the ironies of economic life. It is the success that the workers have achieved in their efforts to protect their wage and salary scales that is primarily responsible for the loss of jobs and the reduction of hours of work during business recessions. When the producer's income drops, either price or volume must come down. Under present conditions, it is difficult to reduce wage rates. The increased rigidity of the wage structure is one of the principal reasons for the growing seriousness of the unemployment problem, and the various measures that could be used to counteract the effect of the wage rigidity have therefore been given extensive consideration in The Road to Full Employment, which is Larson's other book on economics. As brought out in that work, when the cause of unemployment is understood, it can be seen that there are ways of restoring the needed flexibility to the production price structure without returning to the unpopular and rather inequitable practice of giving the employers full control over wage rates. After the decline starts, the downward movement of the cycle is accelerated by a reversal of the influences that aided the upswing. As prices fall, the opportunities for profitable use of credit decrease, and at the same time, lenders become more hesitant about extending credit, as well as less able to do so because of the reduced liquidity of their own assets. The decline in business opportunities and the apprehension about the future combine to encourage storage of money. The fall in the general price level reduces the market value of capital assets and thus contributes powerfully to the contraction in credit. Miscellaneous claims against the future find less ready acceptance. Most of the influences that resisted the upward tendency reverse themselves and resist the downswing. Producers increase their storage of goods, reducing the flow to the markets. This is usually involuntary, as it results from inability to sell the full output, rather than from a deliberate policy of increasing inventories, but the economic effect is the same regardless of the reasons for the action. Government borrowing is usually increased. Those producers who are fortunate enough to have reserves of cash or other liquid assets are able to draw upon them as the incoming stream of money purchasing power diminishes. As brought out in Chapter 11, the stockholders who own all of the fixed assets of a corporation also own the corporate reserves. But while the fixed assets and that portion of the earnings of the enterprise that has been paid out in dividends are not available for meeting current production expenses, any portion of the earnings that has been retained in the form of liquid reserves can be used for this purpose if necessary. Such reserves, which are subject to the control of the officers of the corporation, therefore have the status of producer purchasing power reservoirs rather than consumer reservoirs, even though the ownership rests in the individual stockholders. As the filling of the reservoirs proceeds, the reservoir levels rise above normal levels. A resistance to further input develops in the same way that the resistance to withdrawals increase during the upswing. Again, the reservoirs have limits. Repayment of debts can continue only until the outstanding obligations have been met. Then the payments cease. Storage of money does not have quite as definite an upper limit, but money storage carries a penalty, loss of earning power. And as the losses from this source increase, the resistance to further storage becomes greater. As in the upswing, therefore, the momentum of the decline is finally reversed by the increased reservoir resistance, and the downward movement stops. Here again, the situation is highly unstable. The existing reservoir levels are so far from normal that they can be maintained only by a strong external force, a fear of the future generated by falling prices and declining employment. As the decline tapers off and finally ends, this force weakens. The cost of money storage is harder to justify, and withdrawals from the reservoirs begin. Prices and employment then starts to rise, reversing the psychological outlook, and a new cycle begins. When the recession is relatively mild, recovery from the low point takes place automatically in much the same manner as the decline from the peak. But if it degenerates into a major depression, the problem of getting started on the upward path is more complicated. As noted in Chapter 11, after business has slipped past a certain point, any additional producer income that might develop goes almost entirely to bringing profits back to a tolerable level and does not increase production volume. Without an increase in production and employment, the needed change to a spirit of public optimism is not easily achieved. Furthermore, under such conditions, a strong pressure is exerted on the government to do something. Anything is better than nothing, says the voting public. Unfortunately, something is not necessarily better than nothing. It is often a great deal worse than nothing. Indeed, the majority of the measures that are resorted to under the stress of an emergency where the government is desperate for a remedy of some kind definitely delay or discourage the beginning of a real upswing. If they are justified at all, it is only on the assumption that they head off some still more drastic and destructive action on the part of a dissatisfied populace. There is still another reason why the upturn is not always symmetrical with the downturn, particularly when the depression is severe. This is the fact that it takes a positive decision to spend, whereas not spending is merely negative and requires no specific decision. At the top of the cycle, indecision is equivalent to a decision against further spending and has the same effect toward reversing the cycle. The downswing is therefore certain to begin as soon as the upswing levels off. There is no period of hesitation. At the bottom, however, a positive decision is required to initiate the spending that will operate toward reversal of the cycle, and indecision defers the rise. This explains why governmental measures that destroy confidence can prevent or delay an upturn, although government efforts to maintain optimism are powerless to arrest the start of a decline when business is at the top of the cycle. The pessimism in the depression is not necessarily stronger than the optimism in the boom, but it is more effective because it has powerful allies in uncertainty and indecision. It is evident from the foregoing description of the mechanism of the business cycle that those who are so optimistic regarding the ability of the government to prevent a repetition of the 1930 depression are indulging in wishful thinking. They are not even watching the right horse. They are failing to recognize that a depression is a price phenomenon, and that, however important other features of the downward stages of the business cycle may be, the fall of the price level is the essence of the depression. The deficit spending policy on which so much reliance is being placed will no more be able to cope with a new depression of a major character than it was to meet the situation in the 1930s, when it was pursued with fully as much vigor and enthusiasm as can be expected in the future. There seems to be a general tendency to forget that deficit spending and the built-in stabilizers such as Social Security are not something new that the economists have pulled out of the hat since the Great Depression. The spending programs were carried out on a massive scale during that depression with totally unsatisfactory results. Unquestionably, this kind of a program exerts some influence in the right direction. But as an analysis of the nature of this contribution that will be carried out in a later chapter will show, it puts a heavy burden on business and the taxpayers just at the time they are least able to stand anything extra, and it therefore prevents or delays the restoration of public confidence in the economic situation, which is essential for real recovery. Furthermore, such a program is not powerful enough to meet a major emergency, as there is a limit to the load that the taxpayers can or will support, a limit that is nonetheless real when the government tries to hide it by financial juggling. As the number of persons on government jobs or government support becomes greater, and the number of persons that foot the bill becomes smaller, this limit emerges as a painful reality, and the program bogs down just when it is needed most. The direct connection between the magnitude of the national wealth and the violence of economic fluctuations that was pointed out in an earlier paragraph means that even more powerful anti-depression measures will be needed in the future if the economy remains uncontrolled. As wealth increases, the amplitude of the cyclical fluctuations also increases. That is, depressions become worse. Unless we adopt a program that will actually control the flow of money purchasing power to prevent the cyclical fluctuations, some program that is not, like the deficit spending policy, a burden on the taxpayers and hence subject to collapse at the very time when it is most urgently needed, we can look forward to even worse situations than that which was experienced in the 1930s. Alrighty, that is the end of chapter 14 on business cycles. Chapter 15 is called Money and Credit, and we will get into that chapter tomorrow when we resume. I think I'm going to go back and read that last paragraph over again before I get started with the start of the chapter 15, as it is pretty telling as far as what we're supposed to be doing about business cycles in order to avoid depressions. And so we'll get into that starting tomorrow. But in the meantime, thanks for tuning in today, and have a great day.